Right now, at this exact moment, if you own a Toyota and you have ever opened your hood and seen the top of that engine soaked in a dark, greasy film of oil, somebody in a shop somewhere is already counting the money they plan to take from you. Not because your engine is dying, not because some massive internal seal has catastrophically let go, but because you have never been told about a $4 rubber ring that sits in plain sight right at the very top of your engine and that has been quietly and deliberately ignored by the repair industry for decades. What I am about to show you is so simple, so cheap, and so obvious that the moment you see it, you will feel the anger rise in your chest. Because this is not a mistake. This is not an oversight. This is a calculated, systematic, industry-wide decision to look past a visible $4 part and bill you $1,200 instead. The dealerships know. The independent shops know. The service writers who hand you that clipboard know. And the reason this video exists is to make sure you know too, before you ever hand over another dollar. Let me paint the picture that millions of Toyota owners have lived through. You pop the hood for a routine check. Maybe you smelled something faintly burning, or maybe you just happened to look. And there it is. The entire top of the engine, the valve cover, the area around the intake, the sides of the block, all of it glazed in a thick, wet, brown coating of old engine oil. Your stomach drops. You take it to the shop. The mechanic walks out, lifts the hood for approximately 45 seconds, nods slowly with that practiced look of grave concern, and tells you that your valve cover gasket has failed. He explains that the perimeter seal around the top of the engine has broken down and that oil is weeping out from the entire surface. The estimate comes back between $900 and $1,200, sometimes more. He tells you they need to remove the intake manifold, disconnect sensors and vacuum lines, lift off the entire valve cover, and replace the gasket underneath. Hours of labor. And you, staring at a legitimately oil-soaked engine, have no reason to doubt him. Because the evidence looks overwhelming. The oil is everywhere. Except the oil is not coming from the valve cover gasket. It almost never is on these engines. It is coming from something so small and so accessible that a child could fix it. And understanding why requires going back to the actual engineering of how Toyota built these motors and what happens to pressurized vapor inside a running engine over years of heat cycles. Every internal combustion engine, every single one ever built, generates what engineers call blow-by. As the pistons fire and compress the fuel mixture, microscopic amounts of combustion gas slip past the piston rings and enter the crankcase, which is the sealed lower portion of the engine where the oil lives. These gases carry heat, they carry moisture, and they carry atomized oil vapor. If this pressure were allowed to simply build inside the crankcase, it would eventually overcome every seal in the engine and force oil out everywhere. So engineers designed what is called the Positive Crankcase Ventilation System, or PCV system, which routes those pressurized gases back up through the engine, through a valve, and into the intake manifold to be burned harmlessly with the next combustion cycle. This system has existed since the 1960s, and it is elegant, and it works. But here is where the story gets important. Beginning in the late 1990s and accelerating through the 2000s, Toyota, along with nearly every manufacturer, began engineering their engines for tighter emissions compliance and improved thermal efficiency. The combustion chambers became more precise. The tolerances between pistons and cylinder walls became tighter. The engines ran hotter for longer periods as part of their normal operating profile, and as a direct consequence of all of this, the internal crankcase pressure during normal operation increased. The PCV system was updated and refined, but the fundamental reality remained. These engines breathe. They generate vapor pressure constantly, and that pressure is always looking for the weakest point in the system to escape from. Now look at your oil filler cap, that black plastic cap on top of your valve cover, the one you unscrew when you add oil. It threads onto a short metal or plastic tube that opens directly into the top of the engine, right into the pressurized vapor environment of the valve cover and crankcase ventilation system. And sealing that cap to that tube is one single rubber gasket, a small circular ring of rubber that sits in a machined groove on the underside of the cap, compressing against the rim of the filler tube to create an airtight vapor seal. That is the entire seal. One rubber ring, $4. Now consider what happens to rubber under extreme repeated heat. Every time you start that engine, the temperature around that oil filler cap climbs. On a Toyota 4-cylinder or V6 running hard, the temperatures in the valve cover area can reach well over 250 degrees Fahrenheit during normal operation. The cap cooks, the rubber ring cooks with it. Every heat cycle, the rubber loses a fraction of its elasticity. The oils and plasticizers that keep rubber supple and pliable slowly migrate out of the molecular structure of the material and evaporate. After 5 years, the ring has stiffened noticeably. After 8 years, it has become genuinely rigid. After 10 or 12 years on an older Toyota, that ring has transformed from a soft, compressible seal into something that more closely resembles a hard plastic washer. It no longer compresses when you thread the cap down, it no longer conforms to the mating surface. It sits in that groove as a rigid, shrunken disc with visible gaps around its perimeter. And here is where the mechanical illusion begins. When the engine is running, pressurized oil vapor is being actively pushed up through the ventilation passages and into the valve cover area. That vapor, under pressure, finds the path of least resistance. And the path of least resistance is the microscopic gap between your petrified rubber ring and the rim of the oil filler tube. The vapor forces itself through that gap, but vapor alone would be invisible. The problem is that the oil filler tube connects directly to the interior of the valve cover, where the pressurized vapor is not just gas, but a fine, warm mist of atomized engine oil. That mist gets forced past the failed gasket, hits the cool plastic surface of the cap and the surrounding valve cover, and immediately condenses back into liquid oil. It pools at the base of the filler cap. It runs down the sides of the valve cover. It creeps along every surface it can reach, following gravity, following body lines, seeping into the fins and ridges of the cylinder head. Given enough time, weeks or months of this microscopic weeping, the oil distributes itself across the entire top of the engine. It runs down into the spark plug wells. It drips off the front and rear of the engine. It coats the block below the valve cover rail. Look at that from the outside, and what do you see? You see an engine uniformly coated in oil, with the heaviest concentration around the perimeter of the valve cover. You see oil in the spark plug wells. You see oil on the block. That is the exact visual signature of a failed valve cover gasket. The two failure modes are visually indistinguishable to someone who is not specifically looking for the distinction. And the distinction is this. A failed oil filler cap gasket will show the heaviest oil saturation directly around and immediately below the filler cap itself, often with a distinct residue of baked-on oil crust around the threads. A genuinely failed valve cover gasket will show oil seeping from the press seam between the valve cover and the cylinder head, all the way around the perimeter, with the contamination originating from below the cover rail rather than from the top of the cap. Now I want you to think about a corporate decision for a moment. You are running a service department at a Toyota dealership. You know your technicians handle dozens of these oil-soaked engines every month. You know that the correct diagnosis takes 30 seconds. You look at the filler cap, you look at the gasket, you determine whether the leak originates there or from the valve cover rail. If it is the filler cap, the repair is a $4 part and 60 seconds of labor. You make almost nothing. You cannot justify a flag time to your technician. You collect $4 in parts and maybe $5 in labor if you are being generous. But if you write it up as a valve cover gasket replacement, you are looking at legitimate labor hours, a genuine parts charge for the gasket set, and a total invoice that can climb past $1,200 depending on the engine. Same oily engine, completely different financial outcome. And the choice between those two outcomes comes down entirely to which part your service writer decides to look at first and which one he decides to mention in the estimate. The industry made its choice a long time ago, and the choice was not the $4 ring. The repair itself, the actual cure for this problem, is so fast and so simple that the most challenging part is believing it will work. Start with the engine cold. Always work on a cold engine when you are dealing with anything near the oil system. Unscrew the oil filler cap by turning it counterclockwise. Hold it in your hand and flip it upside down. Look at the underside where it threads onto the tube. You will see a groove machined into the plastic, and in that groove sits the gasket. On a car with a healthy seal, that gasket should be dark, slightly shiny, and when you press it with your fingernail, it should compress and spring back. On a car with this problem, the gasket will be pale brown, completely rigid, and likely visibly shrunken and cracked. It may already be partially delaminated from the groove. Take a small flathead screwdriver or a plastic trim pick. Work the tip gently under the edge of the old gasket and pry it up and out of the groove. It will come out in one piece or several depending on how far gone it is. Clean the groove thoroughly with a rag and a small amount of brake cleaner or carburetor cleaner on a cotton swab, removing every trace of old rubber residue and baked oil. Let it dry completely. Now take your new oil filler cap gasket. You can source this from any Toyota parts counter for around $4 or from any major online retailer by searching for your specific Toyota oil filler cap gasket. Make absolutely certain you have the correct diameter for your engine, as these vary between the 4-cylinder and V6 families. The new gasket should be soft, pliable, and deep black. It should feel almost like a soft pencil eraser. Roll the gasket between your fingers. You will notice it stretches and returns to shape easily. That elasticity is exactly what creates a proper vapor seal under heat. Work the new gasket into the groove on the underside of the cap, stretching it gently around the circumference and seating it evenly into the machine channel. Press it in firmly with your thumb all the way around until it sits flush and even, with no sections riding up out of the groove. Thread the cap back onto the filler tube by hand, turning it clockwise until it seats firmly. Do not over-tighten. Hand tight is correct. You are sealing vapor, not hydraulic pressure. That is the entire repair. Start the engine and let it run for 5 minutes. Come back and look at the area around the filler cap. The weeping has stopped. The source is sealed. The oil that is already on the engine is old residue that will take a few rain events or a careful cleaning to remove completely, but no new oil will follow it. Now I need you to sit with what just happened. A problem that visually presents as a $1,200 repair was permanently cured with a $4 part and 60 seconds of time. The mechanical illusion was so complete, so convincing, that the vast majority of Toyota owners who have lived through this story paid the full estimate without ever questioning it. They paid for intake manifold removal. They paid for valve cover gasket sets. They paid for multiple hours of flat rate labor. They drove away with a clean engine that could have been achieved with a part the size of a large rubber band. The industry built nothing to discourage this. There's no technical service bulletin urging technicians to inspect the oil filler cap gasket before condemning the valve cover seal. There is no standard inspection protocol that flags this item. There is no line on the multi-point inspection form that says, check filler cap gasket condition. The omission is not accidental. A $4 consumable wear item that prevents a $1,200 job is not something the service industry has any financial incentive to publicize, so they have not. And the money has continued to flow accordingly, year after year, engine after engine, check after check signed by Toyota owners who never knew this ring existed. Go check your cap today. Right now, before you close this tab and forget. Go outside, unscrew that filler cap, flip it over, and press the gasket with your thumbnail. If it does not compress, if it feels rigid, if it has visible cracks, or has turned pale, you are looking at the source of your next oil leak before it starts. A $4 fix before the problem begins is the best possible outcome, and if you share this with one person who is currently staring at an estimate for a valve cover job, you may have just saved them $1,000. Share this video. The industry does not want it to exist. And subscribe because next week I am going to show you the single most expensive Toyota repair that dealers perform, a complete timing system, job costing $3,000 or more, and how one specific $20 adjustment that any owner can perform at home can extend the life of that timing system indefinitely by eliminating the exact wear pattern that destroys it. The service department absolutely does not want you to see